This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica. I am your host and the founder of the Voice of Early Childhood. And today with me, I've got Gemma Goldenberg, who is a PhD researcher. So Gemma's already been on a few times on the series on the science behind outdoor play. So she discusses her research and the reason why she left her job as an assistant head teacher to look into the impact of being outdoors on children's stress, attention, and self-regulated behaviour. So this episode is part 3 of the series. And Gemma shares with us the first set of results from her study regarding whether learning outdoors is quieter and less stressful for young children. So, Gemma, thank you very much once again for joining and sharing your research.
Thank you for having me back again.
So, do you want to begin by there's 2 things mainly to discuss, the noise levels and the stress levels as the main findings, but would you like to perhaps say anything else around those findings initially?
Yeah, I suppose just to give a little bit of background to those findings, because I wasn't necessarily aware of this research when I was working in schools. There's a lot out there about the impact of noise on children and how it affects their learning and their behaviour. And I think it's something that as a teacher or an early years practitioner, you're often kind of conscious of when noise levels get really high and kind of encouraging children to quieten down. But there's not necessarily that much information out there about why it's detrimental to children and why noise levels really matter. And it's particularly important for young children that conditions are quiet enough for them to be able to listen to speech and understand what someone's saying in amongst all of that background noise. It's something that I didn't realise until about a year ago, that our ability to kind of pull out the speech that we're trying to listen to and tune into it and kind of ignore all the other noise around us, that's something that develops quite slowly over time, and it doesn't fully develop until children are about 13, 14. So when children in the early years, that's a really underdeveloped skill, and they find it much harder than we do to just tune into that one voice when it's getting all kind of intermingled with all the other sounds that are happening around them. So the younger the children are, the quieter they need conditions to be. And obviously as well, when they're younger, it's so important that they can hear our voices clearly as an adult, because they're acquiring so much language and even the kind of sounds of language. And when you're teaching phonics and things like that, it's really important that they can hear clearly. But those early years environments are often much noisier than classrooms for older children. So it's kind of this double whammy, like younger children need it to be quieter because that part of their brain and that skill isn't as developed yet. And they're picking up a lot more new language than older children. But also the environments they're in tend to be noisier because the children are more active and they're playing. And we want it that way, right? We don't want to go into early years environments and see children sitting in silence. Like that would be difficult. But it is something that we need to be more aware of, about how noise affects learning. And, you know, there's lots of research to read on that. But it was one of the reasons why I was interested to see, is learning outdoors quieter? Because we don't necessarily want to tell children to be quieter. So it's about what can we do in the environment to make the noise levels lower or to make that noise less detrimental for children's learning. And I was just really surprised that there wasn't any research on that already. That felt like quite a simple thing to do, to measure the noise levels indoors and outdoors. And it just hasn't been done. The research wasn't out there. So I was really kind of keen to do that and see what came out of it.
And it is interesting that it hasn't been done before, because it is such a significant part of the environment. When we talk about, even in the EYFS, the enabling environment, it encompasses so many things. And there has been research on like the aesthetics and the colours of the classroom, hasn't there, in terms of, overstimulation for children. But yeah, noise levels, actually, that is something that, when you think about it, has such a huge impact, because as adults, we often find that we can kind of tune in and out of a busy kind of office environment or wherever we're working, in terms of putting headphones in or going to a quiet study space or a smaller office. And there's those booths, isn't there, now, in terms of like noise cancelling for working or having calls. So it really is just as important, if not even more important, to focus on noise levels for, like you say, younger children, because they're still developing that, like, you mentioned earlier, that capability to distinguish between noises and tune in and out.
Yeah, and it's not something complicated or expensive to do either. So, a lot of the equipment that I used as part of my wider research project is, equipment that's quite difficult to get your hands on. It's expensive, it's complicated. A decibel meter is really cheap. You can pick one up on Amazon for about £15-20, or you can just get one for your interactive whiteboard for free if you just type in, noise meter. So it's really easy to measure the noise levels in your classroom, but just not something that I ever thought of doing when I was working in schools, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it's really interesting that you mentioned how easy it is to measure this, because the point of your research is also to ensure that it is seen more widely by policymakers and it's taken seriously in terms of that more empirical research, I guess, or at least objective measures. So it's not just qualitative, but actually, if it's easy to measure, then, like you say, why hasn't it already been done? Why hasn't it been measured when there aren't really many barriers in place?
Yeah, and I think, it's something that I've been discussing quite a lot at the Baby Development Lab where I work, and Professor Sam Wass, who's my supervisor, was saying it has such an impact when you put things in place in classrooms to kind of dampen some of that noise and, soundproofing and things like that. And it doesn't have to be really expensive soundproofing. There are kind of simpler, cheaper things that people can do. But he was saying it's kind of crazy that there's no fund for this. Like, there should be a schools fund for improving the acoustic quality of classrooms, because especially if politicians really care about exam results, that's something that could make a really significant difference to things like exam results further down the line. And there's lots of research that shows it really does affect, children's attainment and how many questions they can complete and how quickly they give up on something difficult. So yeah, it's really surprising that that research hasn't had more of an impact on school funding, classroom design, that kind of thing.
It really is up to the educators themselves to kind of think of that and search for any kind of information and training. It should be something that is more widely shared and spoken about, especially, like you say, by those decision makers who have such an impact in terms of funding and then obviously the quality of education. And it reminds me of a project I'm working on currently, actually, around brain set training and that formula. It's with Dr. Sue Allingham, and actually they have sessions with the educators and look at their environments, and that is the whole kind of point, looking at early childhood environments in all kind of ways, the physical and emotional. And what they have discussed is noise levels as well, and the acoustics that you mentioned. And they were talking about soft furnishings, things like that, hanging things from ceilings, if they've got really tall ceilings as well. So actually, that's been fascinating in terms of what do educators currently do, through their day-to-day practice. And maybe noise levels is something that is kind of on the agenda, but you don't really think too much about it in terms of what is it, what does it mean for children's development? Rather, you think, it's a bit noisy in here, let's quieten down. And I guess you really think about it in terms of well-being, more so in terms of like quiet areas, rather than anything a little bit more, I guess, cognitive, and development-wise in terms of oral language as well, and listening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good to hear that project has looked into it. And there is, there's interest out there. I mean, the Nest Kids, which myself and Sam Wass run, which is like a consultancy where we support schools, we've had more people, I think, recently coming to us asking us to do sessions on noise and the physical environment. That's one of the kind of topics that we cover. And we did some training at a conference to a group of schools where we talked about noise. And actually, one of the head teachers got in touch with us recently to say on their display boards in their classrooms, they had put sort of Hessian, like soft fabric on them rather than having them as a hard surface. And they were looking at whether that made a difference in terms of absorbing some of the noise and kind of reducing the echo. So that was really good to hear. And another school asked us to go in and measure the noise levels in their lunch hall because the acoustics in there were really bad. And the noise levels, I think, it's about 80 or 90 decibels, which is getting close to like a pneumatic drill. When you get up to that level, it's actually dangerous to be, in noise levels that high, but it was just such an echoey space. And of course, lunchtime is one of the times when children are really communicating, and especially the younger children developing that social language. A lot of children at that school as well didn't really do sit-down meals with parents at home. So it was a really important kind of language opportunity for children just being lost because it was so noisy. So it was really nice to kind of go in there and measure that for them and give them some kind of hard data on that so they can then use that to look at how they might kind of change the acoustics of that space to improve the talk during lunchtime.
Hiya, just a very quick and a very exciting announcement from me. The Voice of Early Childhood Conference is back. After the success of our first one, we have organised another one on the 16th of March, 2024. This will be a day full of learning, sparking reflections, sharing, discussing, and networking. Our overarching theme, which fits perfectly with the ethos of the Voice of Early Childhood, is advocacy, agency, and change. So we have Dr. Nathan Archer as one of our speakers, kicking off the conference with his keynote all around advocacy and activism in early childhood, followed by the rest of our brilliant speakers on the day, who are Adam Marriage, who will be discussing leading your team through Ofsted inspections, Dr. Stella Louis, talking about school readiness and intellectual readiness, a question of balance, Ben Kingston Hughes, exploring the power of play, Dr. Valerie Daniel, creative pedagogical practices to encourage agency, Ruth Swales, unpicking how do we construct our own curriculum, Helen Bately, talking about the foundations of early writing, and a special feature from Dr. Sue Allingham, Dr. Sue's Surgery, which you can book into throughout the day. This is an opportunity for a one-to-one Q&A session with Dr. Sue, so really make the most of this special feature by coming prepared with your burning questions, whether this may be around practice, leadership, Ofsted perhaps, or anything else you can think of, you can ask Dr. Sue. We also have a whole conference discussion which is focused on sustainability in early childhood in the widest sense. So we'll be focusing on sustainable development goals, which we will discuss, debate, and really unpick what this means for early childhood and our responsibility as educators within this. Linked to this, there will be a student posters showcase around the Sustainable Development Goals, where we can engage in more discussion and reflections, really focusing on linking theory and academia to practice. So there's lots in store for you on this really exciting day. And as always, you can expect on our conference day opportunities for shared reflection, discussion, and healthy debate, valuable CPD, a diverse range of speakers, a safe space to share your practice and thoughts, a relaxed atmosphere, plenty of opportunities for networking, a selection of exhibitor stands to explore and ask questions, and of course, fantastic food and refreshments as always. And for 2024, we really had to step it up a notch with a choice of workshops, so a leadership or a practice strand to choose from, a start of the day and an end of the day keynote, interactive sessions, and of course our Q&A with Dr. Sue, which is new. So if this sounds like the kind of conference and early childhood community that you would like to be part of, then grab your tickets before they sell out. We do have limited capacity. And if you haven't already heard, you can get 10% off to use at checkout by signing up to our newsletter. I've added the link in this episode description where you can sign up for your code, find more info about the conference and speakers, and access our Eventbrite page to secure your ticket. So I will see you in March. So meal times, like you say, are so important for those social interactions, but also there should be a sense of calm around meal times as well. And that kind of links into you talking about stress levels as well, doesn't it, in terms of your article here and your findings. So yeah, do you want to kind of share what is it that you found around noise levels outdoors then? Because like you say, you were thinking about maybe the outdoors being quiet, and it's almost, when I initially kind of read that, almost thought that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, thinking that the outdoors could be quieter potentially.
Yeah, so I think often when we think about children being inside compared to outdoor play, the children are doing very different activities. So they might be like running around and chasing each other outdoors. They might be climbing, shouting, jumping off of things. Whereas indoors, maybe we think of them as being a bit more sedentary and maybe doing, you know, calmer activities. So one of the important things to remember is in this study that activities were matched indoors and outdoors. So the things the children were doing, whether that was listening to a story or doing a maths activity or doing some construction, it was the same, whether they were indoors or outdoors. So we really just wanted to look at the impact of the environment. But what we found, so we looked at two different things when the children were doing carpet time, so when they were seated listening to the teacher, versus when they were doing choosing time and they were moving around different activities. And measured the noise levels in decibels for both of those. And for both types of activities, it was quieter outside. And that was true. I mean, this was done across lots of different classes of children in lots of different schools and repeated lots of times. So I went into each class 16 times, so 8 sessions indoors and 8 sessions outdoors, because we really wanted to make sure this wasn't just by chance, you know, it's not just a fluke. And for every single session in every single class, it was quieter outdoors. There was absolutely no exception to that. So it was, you know, it's the most robust finding from the project that we've had so far. And, you know, the analyses were done through, you know, all the statistical software as well. And it came out as being statistically significant, which means, you know, it's extremely low, less than 0.005% chance of that being due to a fluke. So, you know, it kind of tells us pretty confidently that, you know, that's a secure finding and that, you know, that's a true effect, as it were, rather than just being a chance. And I think the reason for that, you know, like you said, it can seem counterintuitive, but it's because there's less echo, there's less reverberation when you're outside. You haven't got ceilings and walls for noises to bounce off of. And the more surfaces that the noise can bounce off of, the longer it's staying in that environment. Whereas outdoors, the noise will kind of dissipate much more quickly. So, yeah, we found out for sure that being outside is quieter. And that was true even in schools where we were quite close to the road and to traffic noise. One of the schools we were in was under the flight path for City Airport. So that had a lot of noise from aeroplanes going overhead. But even then, even taking that into account, it was still quieter outside. I guess when you're outside as well, you haven't got that noise coming from the other classrooms. So normally, you know, you're surrounded by other classrooms on either side of you or, you know, in front or behind. Whereas when we were outside, we tended to be, you know, the only group that were using the outdoor space. But we just used whatever outdoor space the schools had available. So, like I said, it often was a playground that was quite close to residential traffic and things like that. But yeah, it was still quieter. And then in addition to that, we also looked at children's stress levels. Because whether or not it's noisy is one thing, but we need to know how is that actually affecting children. Is it more stressful for them? So the children were wearing ECG monitors, heart rate monitors for that. And we were able to monitor their heart rate continually throughout the indoor and outdoor sessions. But in these analyses that I'm talking about today, I just used their resting heart rate, which is when they were sitting down, listening to the teacher read a story. Because if I use their heart rate from choosing time, although all the activities on offer were the same, they might have just been more physically active one day compared to another. So it'd be really hard to say that changes in their heart rate were due to stress, because it could have just been that they were sitting more still that day and so their heart rate was lower, or they were doing construction and moving around a lot more. So we just used their resting heart rate to compare. But again, their resting heart rate on average was lower when they were sat down listening to a story outside compared to inside. So because they were sitting still, we know that wasn't really to do with their levels of movement. So, you know, it is an inference, but I think we can infer that probably their levels of stress were lower outside, and probably because it was less noisy. You know, we know that noise acts as a stressor. It increases levels of stimulation. So if they're sitting outdoors and the environment's quieter, then, you know, it makes sense that their levels of stress would be lower and their heart rates would drop down.
So I'm just thinking in terms of looking at that data, is it that their heart rates, are you looking at their heart rates being lower during that story time because the rest of the time outdoors has impacted their stress levels already? And, you know, also the same for indoors. So it's not just that period of time when they're sat reading a story, because it's almost I know the activity is the same indoors to outdoors, but also wouldn't the noise levels also be the same in a way of, everybody in the class is quiet and listening, and there's not kind of too many noises going on in the classroom anyway at that point. And I guess outside there's almost maybe a little bit more noise from, various things going on outside of the play space. So I'm just thinking, is it that impact of the play that they've had already that has kind of been less noisy outdoors compared to the play that they've had before storytime indoors was quite noisy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are studies that show that when children have gone outside and they've played outdoors, then when they come back into the classroom afterwards, they're kind of calmer and more focused.
Yeah, it's those after effects, isn't it? A lot of the time. Mm-hmm.
But actually, in this study, they did the seated kind of story time first before they went on to their free play, their choosing time. So when they went into the outdoor environment, they straight away went and sat down. We had like a mat that we put outside, and they sat down and did the story. The same inside, the study ran first thing in the morning. So the kids would come into school, do the register, and then straight into that carpet session. So it actually shows that the impact of the outdoor environment happens really quickly, because the carpet sessions, the children were reception age, so they weren't sitting on the carpet for very long. It was sort of normally around 5 minutes, 10 minutes max that they were sitting there for. So it shows that drop in the noise levels and the drop in their heart rates was happening within minutes, within the first kind of minute or two of carpet time. So it actually wasn't to do with the play that they'd already had. And you're right that when the teacher's reading the story, the noise levels are fairly low, but there's always a bit of chatter amongst the children, and there'll be a bit of discussion, obviously, throughout the story with them and the teacher. And then, like we said, that just kind of the surrounding noise. And you're right that there's often not a lot of that. But I think indoors, even if you're reading a story and, another adult walks into the room and they might pull out a chair and it scrapes, or someone comes through and the door slams, or somebody's shuffling, those noises just feel much bigger indoors because of that reverberation. Whereas if you're outside and a child kind of shuffles a bit in their place, you don't really hear it. Or if somebody's kind of walking across, the school garden or the playground, you don't hear those footsteps the same as you would if you were in an enclosed environment. So it just did seem to make a difference, even if the children were just sitting still. And then when we came to look at the impact on their stress, that was where it got really interesting, because in the indoor environment, the noise levels and the children's heart rate were correlated positively. So as the noise levels increased, the children's heart rate increased, and it happened kind of in tandem. There was a really close relationship there. And that's exactly what we would expect. When it's noisier, children are more stressed, their heart rates are higher. And then when it gets quieter, they're less stressed and their heart rate gets lower. That's exactly what we expected to find. But that was only true in the indoor classroom. When the children were outdoors, there wasn't that significant correlation between those two things anymore. So even if the noise levels increased, the children's heart rates weren't increasing alongside that in that close relationship the way they were indoors. And at first we thought, can that be right? And so we started to pick it apart. And we said, okay, let's only look at the noisiest outdoor sessions. So we just went through all the data, and we just took the outdoor sessions where the children were the noisiest. And we said, let's see what's happening with their heart rate here. And even in the noisiest sessions where it was just as noisy as it was indoors, their heart rate still wasn't responding in the same way. So there was something about being outside that was breaking down that relationship between noise and stress. There's something about being outdoors that almost protects children from the stressful effects of noise. And I think, again, it probably comes back to that reverberation and that echo. It feels less intense, and probably just affects us less kind of emotionally and physiologically. And a lot of teachers say that to me as well. Teachers that do forest school and are really into outdoor learning, they kind of say, oh, it's just so much less stressful, like to be outside with them. It's calmer, especially if the children are maybe having quite a restless day or they're really overexcited. There's that kind of, that feeling of like, oh, let's just get them outside, it would just be easier if they're outside. And it does just feels less intense when they're outdoors, even though, some people have said to me, oh, is it because outdoors they've got so much more space and the children can just spread out more, and that's why it's quieter, because they're not all on top of each other. And yeah, for sure, I'm sure if you're kind of going outside into a really big outdoor environment, that would be something that has a big impact. But in this study, we actually measured the size of the indoor classrooms, and we marked out an area that was the same size as the classroom, and we made the children stay within that perimeter. So it wasn't to do with how crowded the space was in this example. They did have to stay within the same amount of space, but obviously on that perimeter, we didn't have walls. There was still more space beyond that. So although they couldn't go into that space, the noise they were making can dissipate into that space, which makes a big difference.
That's a really good point, actually. And I guess also, when you're just talking a little bit more generally about the outdoors and stress levels, there's less constraints outdoors and kind of less rules, I guess, to follow. So maybe that's an impact as well. So really, with research like this, it's so interesting to consider all of the different kind of influences on the findings. Of course, I know that you said there's so many measures that you did control, but there's so many measures that you can't control, I guess, as well. And maybe some children just naturally feel a lot calmer outdoors because of kind of the lack of constraints there that are put on them. So yeah, is there anything that you've kind of identified already that you feel like maybe you're not sure what this is due to? Obviously there's lots of different kind of impacts on the findings, but is there anything that really kind of sticks out?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying about, the way the children feel with less constraints is definitely true. And quite a lot of research about the benefits of outdoor learning says that, it's about it being more child-led, especially when you do something like forest school, it's very child-led. It's not as structured.
And that's something I was going to mention as well. And then I remembered as I was talking that, all the activities were the same. So you did control for that anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why it was really important to me to try and unpick what is it about being outdoors that's beneficial? Is it the pedagogy of, of forest school and the fact that it's really child-led? Or is it just being in an outdoor space? Is it that you're in a forest and there's nature? Or can it still be beneficial to be in a really urban concrete playground? Because I know, most of the schools that I've worked in, they don't have access to go and do forest school. There isn't a forest, you're in the middle of the city. One of the schools I worked in, the playground was on the roof because there was that little space. You couldn't even have it at ground level. So I really wanted to try and see, even if you're in an urban school, outdoors in a concrete playground, can it still have an impact on children? And with how constrained children feel, that was something else that we controlled for. So we worked quite hard to kind of get the children to understand that whatever your rules are for your indoor classroom, it's the same rules for the outdoor classroom. If you're not allowed to run indoors, you're not allowed to run in your outdoor classroom either. That was quite hard. It took quite a few sessions to get the children to understand that. They definitely feel quite compelled to run and jump and climb when they're outdoors. And obviously in real life, you want them to do that. But for the purposes of this study, we did have to try and kind of stop them doing it. But I think that's why these results are really interesting because, it shows that for the noise and the stress, it does have an impact. Even if it's not forest school, even if you don't have a field, even if your outdoor space is quite limited, it shows that children can still get something from being outdoors. But I'm still analysing the data. There's still a lot more to do. I kind of rated each of the outdoor environments at the different schools in terms of the amount of nature they had. And so one of the next steps I'll be doing is looking at, is there a difference there? Was there more stress reduction in the more natural areas? Was there more noise reduction in the more natural areas than in the more urban ones? And kind of trying to pull apart, which outdoor environments had the biggest impact on the children. But it's difficult because obviously schools are different in loads of different ways. So even if I do find a difference between two different schools and say, oh, there was much more of a noise reduction in that school, and I think it's because they had more trees outside, I won't be able to say for sure because there'll be loads of things that were different about that school. The teachers were different, the children were different, the resources they had might have been different. So it's always really difficult with a study like this to say exactly what causes what.
Yeah, of course.
But I think the results that we had with the noise and the stress are, about as robust as we could hope to find in a naturalistic study. We are in schools, we're not in a lab, but to find that statistical significance there was great. And, I'm just working at the moment on publishing these in a paper, and it's a lot easier to get your results published if you found something statistically significant.
Yeah.
I was really pleased to have found that, because hopefully it means it will kind of get published and get out there and read by lots of people.
And like we were saying I think it was the first episode of this series, how important it is to really make sure that the research, the data is taken seriously and it is published and it is seen by people, especially those, like I said at the beginning of the episode, those decision makers and people who fund schools and settings. So it's really interesting to also follow your journey, especially as you say, you're still looking at the findings. So it's really fascinating to kind of really unpick all of these variables and see how much of a kind of tight control you have had to kind of take on so many aspects of the study in order to make sure that you don't just kind of reach some findings that you're interested in. Actually, they need to have an impact, and I think that is just so important for researchers and academics to really focus on in early childhood, because it's the impact on the children and the educators and families that we really need to be kind of seen as our end goal, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and like you said, I'm still kind of working away on this. I'm looking next at all the data on children's attention and whether that was better indoors or outdoors, and then their behaviour as well, looking at their self-regulation and how pro-social and anti-social they were indoors and outdoors. So I look forward to coming back and sharing that with you. But I'm nearly finished on the attention analysis, so I'll hopefully be back quite soon to talk about what we found there.
It is really exciting. Yeah, so we'll hear about all of that in the next episode. So thank you so much for sharing the data so far. And so our listeners can look at read and listen to Gemma's previous episodes and articles on the Voice of Early Childhood website. The link is in this episode description. And yeah, thank you very much, Gemma. It's been fascinating looking at the first set of findings and really looking forward to more.
Thanks a lot.